Mikhail Tal is the first player who comes to mind when we speak about brilliant attacks, combinations and sacrifices. However, there was one player against whom Tal's magic didn't work. This player was no one other than Viktor Korchnoi. Tal had a terrible score against Korchnoi, with only 4 victories, 13 losses and 27 draws. To describe Tal's constant failures against Korchnoi, the Soviet press even used the expression "the paradox of the century." In this video I'm gonna show you one of the most interesting games played between these players. In this game Korchnoi gradually squeezes Tal, then he sacrifices a pawn to initiate an attack and eventually checkmates Tal by bringing his king into the attack. Korchnoi starts with d4 and Tal plays his favorite Benoni defense, knight f6, c4, c5. Korchnoi crosses the center of the board, grabbing space. Tal immediately attacks the central pawn, e6. Korchnoi develops his knight and reinforces the pawn. Tal exchanges on d5 and plays d6, opening his light-squared bishop's diagonal. Korchnoi develops his king's knight and Tal plays g6, preparing the fianchetto of the bishop. Korchnoi in his turn opts for the system with the fianchetto of his light-squared bishop, so he plays g3. Now both players fianchetto the bishops and castle. After which the most common move for black would have been rook e8. But as Korchnoi says, it seems that Tal was afraid of his preparation, so instead of the most common rook e8, Tal plays knight a6. The idea, of course, in order to understand the idea of this move, it's necessary to know the plans of the sides. Black has the pawn majority on the queen side. He has 3 pawns against white's 2 pawns. Besides that, his dark-squared bishop is attacking white's queen side. So black's plan is to push the pawns on the queen side and trying to create the passed pawn. And that's the idea behind knight a6. Black wants to reroute the knight to c7, and from c7 the knight will control the b5 square and support the advance of the b pawn. While white's plan is, of course, to push the central pawn to e4 and prepare its further advance to e5, breaking through in the center and creating attack on the black king. So, in this position, there are different variations for white. One of the common moves for white would have been knight d2, for example, in order to reroute the knight to a great blockading c4 square, from which the knight would attack the black's main weakness on d6, and also control the crucial e5 square, after which white might think about pushing the e-pawn forward. White can also play bishop f4 in order to increase the pressure on the weak d6 pawn. However, in our game, Korchnoi opts for another plan. He keeps his knight on f3, because the knight is quite well placed on f3, it controls the crucial e5 square, and Korchnoi wants to push the e-pawn forward as soon as possible. However, if he plays e4 right away, black might play bishop g4, pinning and exchanging the important knight. This knight is very important in the battle for the crucial e5 square. That's why Korchnoi wants to retain this knight. So before playing e4, he plays h3, preventing bishop g4, and he's going to push his e-pawn next move. So black's position is cramped. Black pieces are cramped. As you see, black pieces are placed on the first 3 ranks. And when you experience the lack of space, and as you see, white has the space advantage, that means black is lacking space, it's always a good idea to exchange pieces. Because when you have little space and a lot of pieces, then of course these pieces don't have enough squares to maneuver. So it's always a good idea to exchange as many pieces as possible. And keeping that in mind, it would be better now for black to play rook e8. On the one hand, this move would prevent the advance of the e-pawn, and most probably Korchnoi would reply with rook e1 in order to insist upon e4, and in this case black could have played knight e4, which would lead to the exchange of a pair of knights, after which black's position would be less cramped. However, instead of this, instead of rook e8 followed by knight e4, Tal plays knight c7 right away, so he wants to start his counterplay on the queen side as soon as possible. The knight controls the b5 square and black is ready to play b5. Korchnoi plays in the straightforward way, e4. He's going to push the pawn forward. And it turns out that black cannot actually push his b-pawn. It seemed that by playing knight c7, black was ready to play b5, but it turns out that if black plays b5 right away, the long diagonal would be weakened and the rook would turn into a target of the bishop. At the moment, there are two pawns on this diagonal, but white would push the e-pawn first with a tempo, attacking the knight, and in case black captures, the second pawn would move away from the diagonal with a tempo, attacking the knight, and after the knight moves, of course, white would capture on e5 with the discovered attack on the rook, and white would be much better. For example, if the rook moves to b8, white can play knight c6 with a fork. So, as immediate b5 doesn't work in this position, Tal plays knight d7, taking under control the e5 square and opening the dark squared bishop's diagonal. Now the bishop, the knight, and the pawn all control the e5 square and prevents white from moving this pawn forward. But Korchnoi insists upon his plan. He plays rook e1. Now the rook supports the e-pawn, and again white might think about pushing this pawn forward. And it turns out that again b5 would be premature. It seems that black controlled this square with two pieces and a pawn, but still e5 would work. In this case, after the exchanges on e5, Korchnoi prepared the exchange sacrifice in order to again unblock his d-pawn. After d takes e, the pawn would move forward, attacking the knight, and again with the discovered attack on the rook. And after the rook moves to b8, white would capture on c7, and after queen takes c7, it turns out that for two pieces, black has a rook and two pawns, so materially the position would be more or less equal, but from the positional point of view, black's position would be terrible, because he doesn't have a dark squared bishop anymore, his dark squares are terribly weakened, and white has two very strong bishops. His dark squared bishop will join the attack on the black king, and white can also centralize his knight with a tempo. White pieces are much more active, and white has a very big advantage. So again, b5 doesn't work. For this reason, Tal plays knight e8. It seems that there is no way to prevent e5, so Korchnoi will continue the preparation of e5 and eventually will play e5. For this reason, Tal plays knight e8 in the anticipation of e5. So after white plays e5, the white e5 pawn will be exchanged for the black d6 pawn, after which the d6 square would be vacated for the knight, and the knight would will occupy this great blockading square and would be greatly placed. That's the idea behind knight e8. Now Korchnoi makes a very sophisticated move. So as you see, black's position has become even more cramped. Now the black pieces are placed on the first two ranks. So black has very few squares to move. Black pieces has very few squares to move, and Korchnoi wants to restrict black even more. So Korchnoi wants to take away the remaining squares from the black pieces, and one of these squares is the f6 square. The black knights might move on this square. For this reason, Korchnoi develops his bishop with a tempo, attacking the queen, and the idea behind this move is to provoke the black bishop to move to f6. Of course, in case black plays pawn f6, then his bishop would be closed by its own pawn. The pawns don't move backwards, of course. The white bishop would simply retreat, the bishop would be closed, and the f6 pawn would occupy this square, the f6 square, and prevent the black knights from jumping on this square, and black would get even more cramped. And in case one of the black knights jumps on f6, this knight would be pinned, of course, and besides that, the f6 knight would close the dark squared bishop's diagonal, and white would easily, it would be much easier for white to play e5. For this reason, after bishop g5, Tal plays bishop f6, and that was exactly Korchnoi's idea, to lure the bishop to f6. Because on g7 the bishop is better placed than on f6. On f6 this bishop occupies this square and prevents the black knights from jumping on this square. So now Korchnoi has a choice, a very important choice to make, either to exchange the bishops or to avoid the exchange. And both of these options have their advantages and drawbacks. The advantage of the exchange is clear. The black's dark squared bishop is very strong. It's black's most active piece. It puts pressure on white's queen side. Besides that, it takes a very important part in the defense of the king side. So from this point of view, the exchange, of course, would be in white's favor. On the other hand, this will be the exchange of pieces, and black's position is cramped. So each exchange would be in black's favor, because after the exchanges his position would be less cramped. So for this reason, in order to keep Tal's position as cramped and squeezed as possible, Korchnoi avoids the exchange. The bishop has completed its mission on g5, it has provoked the black bishop to f6, and now it retreats to e3. Tal plays rook b8, again he thinks about b5, he's ready to play b5. That's why Korchnoi prevents it. He plays a4. Tal insists a6. Again, he's ready to play b5, and again Korchnoi prevents it by playing bishop f1, taking under full control the b5 square. So, as b5 doesn't work, Tal plays queen e7. Now, the pawn, the knight, the queen, and the bishop all control the crucial e5 square, and it seems that Tal has prevented the advance of the e-pawn. But Korchnoi insists. He plays knight d2, unblocking the f-pawn, and he's ready to play f4, and from f4 the pawn will support the advance of the e-pawn. Tal plays knight c7. He also insists upon his plan. The knight from c7 controls the b5 square, and now black is ready to push his b-pawn forward. Korchnoi plays f4, and Tal plays b5. It seems that black has taken under full control this square, while white controls this square only once with his f-pawn. However, Korchnoi still pushes the pawn forward, breaking through in the center, vacating the e4 square for the knight, and after d takes e, unblocking his d-pawn, which might move forward. Not right away, of course, as the black queen would capture it. But first, Korchnoi plays knight e4, as this square is vacated for the knight, and creating an immediate threat, d6. Now the knight, together with the queen, support this pawn, and white is threatening to play d6 with a fork. For this reason, black doesn't have time to capture on f4. He needs to save his material, so Tal retreats the queen to d8, and now Korchnoi finally exchanges pieces, but this time he exchanges his knight for the bishop. So he eliminates the very important bishop. Now the dark squares on black's king side will be catastrophically weakened, and white has retained his dark squared bishop, and this bishop will attack these squares. That means the black king is in trouble. In case black captures the knight with the queen, it would turn out that black has too many pieces on this diagonal. White would simply capture on e5, and it doesn't matter how black captures the pawn, either with the queen or with the knight. Let's say with the knight, the reply would be the same. Bishop f4, attacking all these pieces. For this reason, of course, after knight takes f6 check, Tal captures with the knight. Now the d5 pawn is under attack, and of course, for this reason, Korchnoi doesn't capture on e5. First, he pushes the pawn forward with a tempo, and only after the black knight moves, he captures on e5. Now, Korchnoi's space advantage increases even more. His central pawns have moved forward even further, and he has a very strong protected passed pawn on d6. And he has two bishops, and his bishop's diagonal is open. So he also has the attack on the black king. So white has a very big advantage. And the knight is under attack. In case the knight retreats, then black's position would become even more cramped, while white's activity would increase even more. White can centralize his knight. For this reason, instead of retreating his attacked knight, Tal makes a much stronger move, counter-attacking the opponent's knight. Korchnoi plays knight d5, and at least Tal now manages to exchange a pair of knights, after which, as Korchnoi says, black gets some air to breathe. So black gets some room to maneuver, to move his pieces. So queen takes d5, but black also gets, it seems that black gets some counterplay on the long diagonal. Tal plays bishop b7 now, attacking the queen, and his bishop now is quite strong on the long diagonal. The queen must retreat, and queen d7. Now Tal might play queen c6, creating the queen and bishop battery on the long diagonal, which might be quite dangerous. And also the queen is targeting the h3 pawn, which is defended by the bishop. Korchnoi would love to play bishop c4. On f1 his bishop is quite passively placed, so he would love to play bishop c4, but if he plays bishop c4 immediately, putting pressure on this diagonal, Tal might have played knight d4 with the discovered attack on the pawn, and after white captures the knight, Tal could have captured on h3, creating some unpleasant threats. White would still be better, but Korchnoi didn't want to let Tal get any counterplay. So instead of bishop c4, Korchnoi isn't in a hurry. First he plays king h2, defending the h3 pawn with his king, and now he's ready to play bishop c4. So Korchnoi's plan is now very simple and straightforward. He is simply going to play bishop c4, activating his bishop, then he's going to play b3, reinforcing this bishop and completely blockading the black pawns on the queen side, after which black wouldn't have any counterplay. Then he's going to play rook f1, rook f6, the second rook would move to the f file, then he's going to play bishop h6, kicking out the rook from f8, and play queen f2, after which both rooks and the queen would be on the f file, the f7 pawn would fall, and black's position would collapse. So the plan is very simple. So black must do something about this straightforward plan. But what can he do? In case he plays queen c6, which might look dangerous, black is threatening checkmate in one, that doesn't prevent white from the implementation of his plan. He would simply play bishop c4 as he intended to, and the rook would defend the h1 square, the queen is defending the g2 square, black doesn't have any threats, and white would simply continue his simple plan, and rook f1, rook f6, the second rook would move to f1, queen f2, and white would win. So it doesn't work. What else can black do? Another move that comes to mind is f6, the natural looking move, in order to attack the e5 pawn, which is defending white's strongest pawn on d6, which completely squeezes and restricts black's position. So after the e5 pawn falls, the d6 pawn will be weak, but it doesn't work either. Korchnoi would have simply captured on f6, and after rook takes f6, bishop c4 with a very unpleasant pin. Black is threatening bishop g5, attacking the rook and attacking the pinned knight for the second time. Black can try king h8, moving away the king from this diagonal, but at least white can simply exchange pieces and simply capture on c5. White is up a pawn, and what a pawn? A far advanced passed pawn. The b4 pawn is also under attack, and black doesn't have any compensation for a pawn, so black doesn't have any counterplay, so white is winning. But Tal found a brilliant possibility for a counterplay in this seemingly hopeless position. He plays b3. The idea is to vacate the b4 square for the rook. So Tal is going to move away the bishop from b7, opening the rook's way to b4. The rook will invade this square, attacking together with the queen the a4 pawn, and which is much more important, the rook might be activated by moving to e4, attacking the e5 pawn and creating some counterplay. So Tal found a counterplay in a quite squeezed position by playing b3. And now Korchnoi initiates his attack, his very strong attack. So, as Korchnoi says, time is money. So he doesn't need the pawn, he's going to sacrifice it. The most important thing is to start the attack as soon as possible. So the a4 pawn seems doomed anyways, because black will play rook b4. So Korchnoi leaves it unguarded and develops his rook, rook c1. The rook from c1 will defend the bishop. The bishop will move to c4 and it will be defended by the rook. Tal accepts the sacrifice. Queen takes a4. Now we can see another idea behind the sacrifice of the a4 pawn. The queen is far away from the king side, while white is gonna start a very strong attack very soon. And black will need to spend more time in order to return his queen so that the queen can take part in the defense of the king side. And of course, now that the rook defends the c4 square, Korchnoi invades this square, activating his bishop. Bishop c4. Tal plays bishop c8, opening the rook's file. Now he's ready to play rook b4. Korchnoi plays rook f1, putting pressure on the half-open file. Of course, rook b4 followed, attacking the bishop. Now black is threatening to capture this bishop. That's why Korchnoi exchanges on e6, and after bishop takes e6, of course, bishop h6. So we get the position with the opposite colored bishops. White has the dark squared bishop, white has black has the light squared bishop. And in these kind of positions, of course, the attacking side, the side which has the initiative, has a very big advantage. Korchnoi even says that white is up a piece, because while white is attacking black on the dark squares, so his bishop is very strong, black's light squared bishop cannot take part in the defense of the dark squares. So from this point of view, black's bishop is completely useless. And in this position, so black's position is already critical, Tal makes a mistake, a tactical mistake. He should have played, as his rook is under attack, rook b8. Instead, he moves his rook to e8. And you will see the difference very soon. You will see why rook e8 was a mistake. So, of course, Korchnoi continues his attack, queen g5. He threatens queen f6, followed by checkmate on g7. Black's position looks critical. Tal plays rook e4, attacking the pawn and also threatening rook e2 check. It turns out that in case white plays in the straightforward way, queen f6, threatening checkmate in 1, the game would have ended in a draw. Tal would have played rook e2 check, and after rook f2, the rooks would be exchanged, the queen must leave the f6 square, and black would play queen d4, offering the exchange of the queens. Of course, if white exchanges the queens after c takes d, the position would be absolutely equal. And if the queen returns to f6, renewing the threat of checkmate, black would simply capture on b2 with a check, and it turns out that in case the king moves to the light squares, black would play bishop d5 check, and black would even be better. So the only square would be for the king g1, and then the queen would move to d4, again with a check, and again the king cannot move to the light squares for the same reason. Neither can it move to f1 because of bishop takes h3 check, so the king would be forced to return to h2, after which again queen b2 check would follow, and the game would end in a draw with the perpetual check. For this reason, after rook e4, in order to prevent rook e2 check, Korchnoi plays rook f2 first. And now you can see why rook e8 was a mistake. In case the rook was on b8 instead of e8, now Tal could have played queen d4, attacking the rook and also attacking the e5 pawn for the second time. And in case white played queen f6, he could have captured on e5, defending against the checkmate. But now that the rook is on e8, this variation doesn't work, because now white could have played in this position d7, attacking the rook, which wouldn't have worked if the rook was on b8, because d7 wouldn't come with a tempo, wouldn't attack the rook. But now that the rook is on e8, d7 works, because in this position now, of course, black cannot capture on f6 because of simple promotion to the queen with a checkmate. Neither can black capture on d7, because the bishop must defend the f7 pawn. If black captures the pawn, then queen takes f7 check, again would lead to checkmate in a few moves. For this reason, the only way to defend against a terrible threat of queen f6 and queen g7 checkmate is f5. And that's exactly what Tal played. The idea is to open the 7th rank for the queen. The queen will return to d7 and defend the g7 square. Queen f6, Korchnoi invades, and of course queen d7 followed. And now Korchnoi returns the sacrificed pawn. Rook takes c5, creating an immediate threat of rook c7, invading, attacking the queen, and that would be the end. That's why Tal plays rook c4, preventing it. The rooks are exchanged, and now rook d2, supporting the d pawn. In case the queen moves away from d7, Korchnoi would immediately push the d pawn with great effect, attacking the rook and also threatening to promote to the queen. So the black queen cannot leave the d7 square. Bishop returns to e6, reinforcing the blockade of white pawns, and rook d1, again creating a threat of rook c1, occupying the open file, followed by rook c7. A terrible threat, but Tal is very resourceful, so he always finds the possibilities for the counterplay. So he plays queen a7. It turns out that now d7 doesn't work, neither does rook c1. For example, in case white plays rook c1, queen f2 check would follow, followed by checkmate. So by playing queen a7, Tal has created a terrible threat of the invasion on f2. For this reason, Korchnoi plays rook d2, taking under control this square and renewing the threat of d7. That's a terrible threat, because if black captures the pawn with the bishop, immediately checkmate on g7 would follow. For this reason, Tal returns his queen to d7 to blockade the d6 pawn. And now, in this position, the game was adjourned. And in his home analysis, Korchnoi found a very interesting idea. So at first sight, it isn't clear how white can break black's position. Black has defended against the checkmate and has blockaded the pawns. But Korchnoi found the way of increasing the pressure. When the game was resumed, he repeated the move, rook d1, again threatening rook c1. Tal also repeated, queen a7, renewing the threat of queen f2 check. But this time, instead of rook d2, Korchnoi plays rook d4, closing the queen's diagonal. Now there is no queen f2. Neither can the queen capture the rook, of course, because of checkmate in 1. And the rook is very well placed on the 4th rank. It is very active, and you will see how strong it is on the 4th rank later in the game. So now again, white is threatening to push his d-pawn, so the queen must return to d7. And now you can see the idea Korchnoi found in his home preparation. He plays g4. The idea is to vacate the g3 square for the king. As you saw, the king became a target of attack of the black queen. So Korchnoi is going to reroute his king to g5. And on g5, the king will be much safer than on h2. Besides that, the king will take part in the attack on the black king. And also, the white king, will support the advance of his passed pawns. So, what can black do? The only chance for counterplay is a5. That's exactly what Tal did. He's going to push this pawn forward in order to create a passed pawn and hopefully promote to the queen. King g3 followed. Now you see the power of the rook on the 4th rank. Black cannot continue pushing his pawn forward. In this case, white would simply capture the pawn, and black cannot recapture because of checkmate on g7. So, what else can black do? he cannot push his pawn forward. So black would love to exchange the queens by playing queen f7. But at the moment it doesn't work. For the same reason, white would immediately push the pawn forward and would lose. For example, after bishop takes d7, white would simply exchange the queens and capture on d7. White is up a piece. For this reason, Tal prepares queen f7. He moves his rook away from e8, and now he's ready to play queen f7, because d7 would come without a tempo. It wouldn't attack the e8 rook. King h4, and now queen f7. Now d7, of course, doesn't work, but the king is right on time. King g5, defending the queen. And it turns out that if Tal exchanges the queens, he would lose on the spot, because the white king would invade with great effect, attacking the bishop. If the bishop moves, then the e-pawn would move forward, and if black tries to keep the blockade by playing rook e8, then the d-pawn, of course, would move forward. For this reason, black cannot exchange the queens, so Tal exchanges on g4. Korchnoi recaptures, and now what next? Black still cannot play a4, because the rook would simply capture it. That's why Tal plays bishop d7, taking under control the a4 square and preparing the advance of the a-pawn. Korchnoi makes another strong move, rook c4. Of course, the queen cannot capture because of the checkmate, and by playing rook c4, Korchnoi again created a threat of rook c7, invading the 7th rank. Again, black cannot exchange the queens. This time, after queen takes f6, king takes f6, again, white is threatening e6, and in case black tries to hold the blockade by playing rook e8, the rook would invade the 7th rank, attacking the bishop. If rook e6 check, it seems that black is winning the pawn, but it isn't the case. Simply king g5, rook takes e5 check, and after king f4, it turns out that both the rook and the bishop are under attack. Black is losing material. Or instead of rook e6 check, if black captures on g4, then the 7th rank would open and the rook would invade g7. If king f8, then rook takes g6 checkmate, and if king h8, then rook e7, threatening to capture. Black cannot capture on e7 because after d takes e, the white pawn promotes, so black must save his rook. And for example, after rook d8, king f7, taking under control the g8 square and threatening checkmate in 1. So after rook c4, Tal plays as he still cannot exchange the queens, he plays a4. Now he's ready to push the pawn forward and create a passed pawn. And Korchnoi invades. Rook c7, and again, now queen takes f6 doesn't work either, because after king takes f6, a3, it seems that black can promote to the queen, but it doesn't work because of e6. Now if bishop takes e6, then king takes e6, a takes b, d7, black promotes to the queen, but his king gets checkmated after rook takes and promotion to the queen, checkmate. Neither can, instead of bishop takes e6, black capture on b2. In this case, again, after e takes d, promotion to the queen, rook c8, rook takes, d takes 8, c8, again, checkmate. So, again, queen takes f6 doesn't work, so Tal plays a3. What to do now? Black has defended against the checkmate. He is blockading the white pawns, and it isn't clear how white can increase his pressure. And black is threatening to promote to the queen, so white must do something. Now you can pause the video and try to find Korchnoi's next move. So it's time to break the blockade. The main blockading piece is the bishop. So Korchnoi sacrifices the exchange in order to break the blockade. Rook takes d7. Again, black cannot exchange the queens because after this time white will capture with a pawn. And after a takes b, f7 check, king h8, king f6, again black promotes to the queen, and again his king gets checkmated. For this reason, after rook takes d7, Tal captures on d7. But now that the blockade is broken, the pawn moves forward with a tempo, attacking the queen. Of course, the queen cannot capture on d6 because of checkmate. But Tal keeps resisting until the very end, queen a7, creating a very unpleasant threat of queen e3 check. Korchnoi prevents it. Queen e5, taking under control the d-square and supporting the advance of his e-pawn. Now white is threatening to play e7. Tal captures on b2. Now he needs the last move to promote to the queen, but e7, closing the queen's line. Now the queen doesn't control the g7 square. White is threatening checkmate in 1 and also checkmate in 2 besides that, to promote to the queen, and after rook takes e8, queen takes e8, checkmate. That's why, to parry both of these threats, Tal plays king f7. Now the king is ready to escape via e8. In case black manages to do it, he might even win this game. He's up the exchange and his pawn is one step away from the promotion to the queen. But Korchnoi makes his last move, d7. Now both of his pawns have reached the 7th rank and takes under control the e8 square, preventing the king from escaping and creating an immediate threat of promotion to the queen. And after rook takes, the second queen would appear again, d takes e, or queen takes e8 with a checkmate. In case now, in order to prevent this, black captures on d7, which looks like the only move, white would play queen f6 check, and if king e8, then of course queen f8 checkmate, and if king g8, then queen g7 checkmate. For this reason, after d7, Tal resigned. And now I recommend watching a game in which Korchnoi sacrifices material in order to develop enormous initiative. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.